MIT, 1939. A freshman walks into a physics lecture with a blank notebook. While 200 students frantically copy equations from the blackboard, he writes nothing. His pen stays capped. His eyes track the professor's chalk, but his hand remains still. Later, in his dorm room at 3 a.m., he opens that same notebook. For the next 3 hours, he reconstructs the entire lecture from memory, but not as notes. As equations, he derives himself. By graduation, he'll have 47 of these notebooks. They won't contain a single copied formula. 26 years later, he'll use this same method to win the Nobel Prize. The reason why destroys everything you know about learning. Richard Feynman's notebooks weren't normal. They contain no highlighted passages, no copied textbook solutions, no bullet-pointed summaries from lectures. Instead, they were filled with crossed-out attempts, failed derivations, dead ends, and eventual breakthroughs, evidence of a mind not absorbing information, but building it from scratch. While his classmates treated their notebooks as storage devices for other people's thoughts, Feynman treated his as battlegrounds where ideas fought for survival. The difference seems subtle: copy versus reconstruct, passive versus active. But that difference created a chasm between temporary familiarity and permanent mastery. The reason why changes everything about how you learn. Schools taught one method, Feynman discovered another. And the second method, brutal, slow, frustrating, is what they never told you about genius. The education system has a profitable lie at its core. Knowledge is something you receive. Attend the lecture, read the textbook, take the notes, review before exams. This creates the illusion of learning. You recognize concepts when you see them again. You feel productive while highlighting and rereading. Your brain mistakes this recognition for understanding. But recognition fades in 48 hours. And when you need to apply that knowledge without a reference book, in a meeting, an interview, a real problem, the illusion shatters. You realize you never actually learned it. You just borrowed someone else's understanding temporarily. This is why you forget everything you read within a week. This is why you can't explain concepts you think you know. This is why credentials don't guarantee competence. The conventional method creates intellectual dependence. You need the textbook. You need the lecture slides. You need to Google it. You're never free from the source because you never built the understanding yourself. You're renting knowledge, not owning it. Feynman did the opposite. He refused to copy. He refused to highlight. He refused to passively absorb. Instead, he reconstructed everything from scratch in his notebooks. This forced his brain to build understanding rather than borrow it. The difference is brutal. One creates dependence on external sources. The other creates independent thought. One produces temporary familiarity. The other permanent infrastructure. As he later explained in his Nobel acceptance speech, I learned very early the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing something. The notebooks were where he learned the something. Everything else was just names. But understanding how this worked requires seeing what he actually did in those 47 notebooks. Because this wasn't about having better handwriting or prettier formatting. This was about transforming the notebook from a passive storage device into an active thinking tool. And the transformation happened through 4 specific principles that schools never taught. Caltech, 1960s. Feynman kept a mental list, later documented in his notebooks, of 12 fundamental problems he found beautiful. As he described in Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, whenever he encountered new information, he didn't ask, is this interesting? He asked, does this connect to one of my 12 problems? If yes, he wrote it down and explored the connection. If no, he ignored it completely. When a colleague casually mentioned superfluidity at lunch, Feynman didn't file it as random trivia. He immediately connected it to problem 7 on his list. Why do particles behave differently in groups? Within 3 weeks, his notebook contained 17 pages of new theories about quantum liquid behavior, all sparked by that single filter question. The 12 problems weren't random. They were carefully chosen obsessions that defined his intellectual identity. Some were broad. What is the relationship between mathematics and physics? Others were specific. Why does helium become a superfluid at low temperatures? But they all shared one quality. They were problems he genuinely couldn't stop thinking about. The list wasn't about being comprehensive. It was about being honest about what actually fascinated him. While most people consume information reactively, reading whatever appears in feeds, courses, or books, Feynman consumed actively through this filter. The notebooks weren't just storage. They were battlegrounds where new information had to prove relevance to existing obsessions. This created two massive advantages. First, everything he learned had immediate context, making it stick naturally without forced memorization. Second, he avoided information overload because 95% of incoming noise failed the filter test. It was irrelevant to his 12 problems, so it never entered his system. But why did this work when conventional note-taking failed? The cognitive principle is brutal in its simplicity. Your brain can't retain information without connection points. When you passively consume random facts, your brain has nowhere to store them. They float disconnected, vulnerable to immediate forgetting. But when you filter everything through 12 core problems, every new piece of information arrives with built-in connections. It's not random, it's ammunition for an existing obsession. The filter wasn't about being narrow. It was about building a knowledge immune system that rejects noise and amplifies signal. This wasn't just about physics problems. It was about building deliberate intellectual infrastructure instead of letting random inputs control your attention. Feynman's notebooks reveal something schools never teach. The goal isn't to learn everything. The goal is to build weaponized knowledge around specific targets. The same principle applies today when you're drowning in online courses, podcasts, newsletters, and LinkedIn thought leadership. Before consuming anything, define your personal 12 problems, the core questions your career, projects, or genuine curiosity revolve around. When you encounter information, ask Feynman's filter question. Which of my 12 problems does this solve? If none, delete it. No guilt, no FOMO. If yes, capture it in your system, whether that's Notion, Obsidian, or paper, and immediately explore how it connects. You're not learning everything. You're building a targeted arsenal. The modern equivalent, your 12 problems become your personal algorithm that pre-filters information before your attention gets hijacked by whatever platform wants to monetize your focus. But the filter was just step one. What Feynman did with information that passed the filter was even more radical. MIT, 1939. Professor Morse assigns advanced calculus reading. Feynman's classmates dutifully copy textbook solutions into their notes, highlighting key steps in yellow. Feynman opens his black marble notebook, blank pages staring back. He reads the problem once, closes the book, then attempts to solve it from scratch. He fails. The algebra breaks down. He tries again with a different approach. Fails again. On the fourth attempt, 6 hours later, he derives a solution. But it looks completely different from the textbook's approach. His method is 3 times longer, uses unconventional notation, and arrives at the same answer through a path nobody else took. He then opens the textbook and compares. His method revealed 3 hidden assumptions the textbook glossed over. It exposed 2 alternative solution paths the book never mentioned. It forced him to understand why certain steps worked, not just that they worked. The textbook gave him the destination. His notebook gave him the map of the entire territory. Years later, this habit produced his path, integral formulation of quantum mechanics, a completely original derivation of existing physics that nobody else had seen, because everyone else just studied the standard textbook versions by Dirac and Heisenberg. They learned physics. Feynman rebuilt it. While others treated the textbook as the destination, copy it, memorize it, regurgitate it, Feynman treated it as mere validation for his own thinking. The cognitive difference is brutal. When you copy, your brain experiences recognition. Yes, this looks familiar. When you derive from scratch, your brain experiences construction. I built this. Recognition fades in 48 hours. Construction becomes permanent mental infrastructure. Feynman's notebooks weren't filled with copied formulas. They were filled with failed attempts, crossouts, dead ends, and eventual breakthroughs, evidence of cognitive work. This wasn't about physics. It was about forcing the brain to build instead of borrow. Each derivation was mental weightlifting. Each copied formula was mental atrophy. As he explained in What Do You Care? What other people think, I don't know what's the matter with people. They don't learn by understanding. They learn by some other way, by rote or something. Their knowledge is so fragile. To understand why this matters, fast forward to Los Alamos, 1943. The Manhattan Project needs classified physics recalculated. Security protocols forbid accessing certain documents without clearance. Feynman sits down with blank paper. He doesn't consult his own classified notes from previous work. Instead, he rederives everything from first principles, particle behavior, energy calculations, chain reaction mathematics. He finishes in 3 days. Colleagues using reference books take 2 weeks. Security officers are suspicious. How does he know this without reading the classified material? His answer reveals everything. I derived it. He didn't need to remember it because he never memorized it in the first place. He understood the principles so deeply that reconstruction was faster than memory. The principle wasn't about showing off. It was about independence. When you copy, you're permanently tethered to the source. When you derive, you become your own source. The notebook method transformed Feynman from someone who knew physics into someone who could rebuild physics on demand. When you're learning to code, don't just follow tutorials step by step. Read the tutorial once, close it, and try rebuilding the project from memory. You'll fail initially, exactly like Feynman did with calculus at MIT. That failure is where learning lives. Each error exposes a gap between recognition and understanding. When you're studying finance, don't highlight someone's valuation model. Close the book and try building your own from first principles. When it breaks, compare it to the expert's version. The differences reveal what you don't actually understand. Modern trap. Tutorial hell, where you can build anything while following instructions, but nothing when the tutorial ends. Modern solution. The Feynman derivation cycle. Read once, close source, reconstruct, fail, compare, identify gaps, repeat. It's slower initially, but you're building permanent understanding instead of temporary familiarity. But there was a third principle that turned notebooks into lie detectors for fake knowledge. Caltech, 1961. Feynman agrees to teach freshmen physics, a course most Nobel laureates consider beneath them, but he has a rule meticulously documented in his notebooks. Every concept must be explainable to someone who knows absolutely nothing. He spends 3 weeks preparing the first lecture on forces. His notebook shows 17 different attempts to explain Newton's laws without jargon. Each draft gets simpler. Version 1. Technically accurate, abstractly correct, completely incomprehensible to anyone without a physics degree. Version 17. Push something, it pushes back. That's all forces are. This standard, later called the Feynman technique by educators, came directly from his notebooks. If he couldn't explain it simply, he didn't understand it. The technique wasn't pedagogy. It was his personal lie detector for fake knowledge. The contrast with his colleagues was stark. Murray Gell-Mann could dazzle audiences with sophisticated vocabulary and complex frameworks. But when pressed to simplify, the explanation collapsed into jargon. Feynman knew immediately. Gell-Mann had borrowed the understanding from somewhere else. When Feynman could teach quantum electrodynamics to freshmen, he knew he'd mastered it at a level where even jargon became optional. While most experts demonstrate knowledge through complexity, technical terminology, sophisticated frameworks, impressive vocabulary, Feynman tested knowledge through simplification. The cognitive principle. Complexity hides gaps, simplicity exposes them. If you can't explain something simply, it means your understanding is either incomplete or over-reliant on borrowed terminology. You're using fancy words as a crutch because the actual understanding isn't there. Feynman's notebooks forced brutal honesty. He wrote explanations for an imaginary freshman with no background. When sentences became complicated, he circled them and rewrote. Each simplification revealed an assumption he hadn't examined or a concept he didn't truly grasp himself. This wasn't about dumbing down. It was about building understanding, so solid, it didn't need jargon as armor. The notebook became a mirror, showing him exactly where his thinking was clear and where it was faking clarity through vocabulary. Before any presentation, interview, or major decision, open a blank document and explain your idea as if teaching a smart 12-year-old. If you need technical jargon to make it work, you don't understand it yet. You've just memorized someone else's explanation. When preparing for technical interviews, explain the algorithm to an imaginary friend who codes but doesn't know this specific algorithm. gaps will appear immediately. When pitching a business idea, explain it without using industry buzzwords like synergy or disruption. If it collapses without those words, you're selling vocabulary, not value. Modern application. Before posting that LinkedIn thought leadership piece, try explaining it to a friend outside your industry over coffee. If they're confused, your understanding is borrowed, not built. But there was one more principle that made the notebooks work, something most people miss entirely. Los Alamos, 1945. A colleague asks Feynman why he doesn't just solve problems mentally. After all, he's clearly capable of intense mental calculation. Feynman opens his notebook and points to a page filled with crossed-out equations and revised attempts. When it's all in my head, he explained in a later interview, I can lie to myself about whether something works. On paper, the math doesn't let me cheat. He described internal thinking as inherently messy, full of half-formed ideas, hidden contradictions, and logical dead ends that mental thought alone couldn't untangle. The notebook wasn't storage, it was a debugger for faulty logic. Years later, during the Challenger investigation in 1986, he insisted on writing everything down during NASA testimony. While other commissioners relied on memory and consensus, his notebook caught the contradictions between what officials claimed and what the data showed. Everyone else heard the same testimony. Only Feynman's notebook revealed the inconsistencies because only Feynman externalized the information where contradictions became visible. While most people see writing as a way to record finished thoughts, Feynman used writing to build thoughts. The difference: internal thought is fast but sloppy. Your brain skips steps, makes unjustified assumptions, and experiences confirmation bias without noticing. External thought on paper is slow but honest. You can't skip steps because they're visible. You can't hide assumptions because they're written down. The physical act forced accountability. This wasn't about pen versus keyboard. It was about externalizing cognition so you could examine it like a scientist examines data. The notebook transformed thinking from an invisible, unreliable process into a visible, debuggable one. Each written line was a hypothesis. Each cross-out was a falsified claim. The page became a laboratory for ideas where bad logic couldn't hide behind mental speed. The principle, externalizing thought for debugging, works identically today, whether you use paper or Notion. When solving complex problems, write out your thinking step by step in a document. Don't just write the conclusion, write the reasoning chain. Seeing it externalized immediately reveals logical leaps, hidden assumptions, or circular reasoning you'd miss entirely in your head. When making important decisions, write out your complete case for each option. The act of articulating forces clarity that mental rumination never achieves. Modern trap. I'll just think it through. Modern solution: force externalization. Notion, Obsidian, Google Docs, or paper, the medium doesn't matter. What matters is converting invisible thought into visible logic you can debug, exactly like Feynman did in his 47 notebooks. When you combine the 12 problems filter, the derive don't copy principle, the explain simply test, and the physical externalization method, you get something schools never teach: independent thought infrastructure. This is why Feynman won the Nobel Prize in 1965, not because he was born with a higher IQ than his colleagues, but because his notebooks transformed him into a thinking machine that didn't need external validation to verify understanding. While others needed textbooks to confirm they were right, Feynman's notebooks made him his own verification system. While others needed credentials to prove competence, Feynman's ability to explain complex physics to freshmen became the credential itself. But the deeper revelation isn't about physics or Nobel Prizes. It's about liberation from intellectual dependence. Every copied note, every highlighted sentence, every passively consumed lecture keeps you reliant on someone else's understanding. You're borrowing their way of seeing the world, their way of solving problems, their way of thinking. Feynman's method, brutal, slow, frustrating at first, builds cognitive sovereignty. You're not learning what others think. You're learning how to think. The notebook wasn't a tool for storing information. It was a declaration of independence from the educational system's most profitable lie. That knowledge is something you receive rather than something you build. As Feynman said in his Nobel lecture in Stockholm, I learned very early the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing something. The notebooks were where he learned the something. Everything else was just names, impressive vocabulary masking borrowed understanding. This is the genius the system deliberately hides. You don't need their names, their credentials, their textbooks, their courses. You need their method, and the method is simple. Reconstruct everything from scratch until you can explain it to someone who knows nothing. The notebooks were just the battlefield. The real war was against borrowed understanding. The difference between Feynman and his equally credentialed colleagues wasn't innate talent. It was method. One group consumed knowledge. Feynman constructed it. One group could pass tests. Feynman could rebuild entire fields of physics from memory. One group needed the system. Feynman became independent of it. The next time you open a course, a textbook, or a tutorial, remember MIT 1939. Remember the freshman who refused to copy while 200 classmates frantically scribbled notes. Remember the 47 notebooks filled not with other people's ideas, but with his own reconstructions, failures, and breakthroughs. The difference between memorizing and mastering isn't talent or IQ. It's method, and the method is brutally simple. Close the source, open a blank page, and force yourself to rebuild what you just learned from absolute nothing. It'll feel impossible at first. Your derivations will fail. Your explanations will collapse into confusion. You'll be tempted to peek at the textbook, to copy just this one formula, to highlight instead of reconstruct. That temptation is your brain trying to stay dependent. The difficulty isn't a bug in the system, it's the feature. The struggle is where independence gets built. Feynman didn't become a genius because of notebooks. He revealed his capacity for systematic thought by using them correctly. The same capacity exists in you. It's not about being smarter, it's about being more honest with yourself, about the difference between recognition and understanding, between borrowed knowledge and built knowledge, between dependence and sovereignty. The question isn't whether you're smart enough. The question is whether you're willing to do what schools never taught you. Stop borrowing understanding and start building it, one reconstructed concept at a time. But this method was just one piece. Feynman used another technique, what he called the problem of productive doubt, that most people get completely wrong about how curiosity actually works. Thus, notebook method showed you how to build understanding. The doubt method showed you which understanding was worth building in the first place.